Hey everyone, so in this video I'm just going to be going over the 26.1 update to the game, and to be honest, there's a pretty exciting update that's occurring. So there's some general bug fixes, some combat effects that are updated, but the biggest update in my opinion is trauma. So there's a trauma update. Trauma will now trigger from resisted effects in addition to recovering effects. So the new trauma description: a character under the effect of trauma receives a specified amount of unmitigated damage each time another status effect or damage over time is resisted or recovered from that character. Now, this means mods will now actually be a hindrance on some characters, because if you resist stun, for example, and have trauma applied, you are receiving flat damage from that trauma effect, which is huge, to be honest, especially because trauma stacks. So trauma independently stacks. So if you have Willy and Angel, for example, both of their traumas will be added together. And then trauma damage also stacks per each negative status effect or damage over time effect that is resisted or recovered. So if a toon has burn, bleed, and resists stun, well, they'll take 2,000 damage, for example, if the trauma is 2,000 for the stun being resisted. And if the burn and bleed are recovered and actively recovered, meaning a toon's rush, active skill, or weapon somehow recovered them from one of these debilitating status effects, you will also get 2,000 trauma damage per recovery. Of course, all of this is dependent on trauma being applied. And with Willy having just been released and being a free-to-play toon, it actually makes trauma to be a little bit more effective without having to rely upon Willy's active skill, for example, where Willy's active skill actually recovers all penalties from the enemy. So if you're anything like me, you're kind of thinking, well, Traitor and his Resilient, 50% of the time he resists everything. So if you can successfully apply trauma to the Traitor, well, he could end up taking a ton of trauma damage, which is unmitigated and flat damage. But that's, of course, assuming you can apply the trauma. And to be honest, I foresee a lot of Traitors having trauma resist being added to him, so then he becomes immune. But if he becomes immune to trauma, it means he's no longer immune to, let's say, stun or confuse, daze, and so on. There's just so many other abilities that you can use to help control him, and really control a lot of different toons. It's going to be interesting to see if trauma does become the new meta, because it is very dependent, or at least it was very dependent, on what the opponent did. Willy kind of flipped the switch on that by the attacker being in control of when the enemy recovers from different penalties. But now, if it's also based off resistances, well, active skills can provide some resistance, like immunity. There's weapons that can provide immunity, and we're thinking like Michonne, the new one. We're thinking Axel and his leadership skill, so 100% stun resist. I really do find it fascinating how such a small change to the game is actually very significant, and I think it'll be beneficial for everyone, especially free-to-play players, because we have Angel and we have Willy. Both of them can apply trauma damage. We also have Fang. She also applies trauma damage, I believe, on her active skill. It's lower, but because it does stack, it gives us kind of a unique look at different teams we could create. Like, I'm thinking right now, free-to-play players could create something like a bleed trauma team, where you either bleed out the enemy or you provide trauma to them so that everything that they resist, they actually end up taking a flat amount of damage. I'm also foreseeing a potential trauma leader coming out eventually, where the leader skill will provide 2,000 trauma damage at the beginning of a match, which would be very, very interesting, because it would be dependent on the opponent resisting effects or you recovering them off of their team, or them actively recovering it with active skills and whatnot. It'll be very interesting because certain active skills, when used by the AI, will automatically recover abilities, but with trauma being applied, it could end up being those toons' death sentences. And I guess on a side note, it's nice to see that choice box 4 from the war wheel will be removed. It doesn't say when this update is coming, but I will be very excited when that 50 card choice box is gone. And then in the rest of the post, we see some general bug fixes and some combat bug fixes. So let's see. Fixed an issue where opening mod boxes could cause a game reload. This has been happening to me the whole time during Wayland's Anvil event. Negative coin balances, that was frustrating for a lot of people because it took from your coins instead of from your inventory. Black market tab, naming of things came up incorrectly. That doesn't bother me as much, but I am glad that it's getting fixed. The fixing of attack down resist or defense down resist, giving incorrect visual images of like what a toon's attack and defense are. Lily's adrenaline rush, doing damage even though the MAME is resisted. That's a good one to fix. Fire starter, okay, yep, so that it'll proc from multi-attack adrenaline rushes. So like Steve is a great example of that. Fixed an issue that was preventing the healing effect on Willie's weapon. Now, I thought that was a visual effect, but I guess it must have been an actual bug on the weapon itself. So that's another good one to fix, considering Willie is a new toon that we've all been able to acquire if we chose to. Now, going back to the trauma update, I just want to go over some of the toons that, we've received or have been able to acquire that have trauma on them that you might have overlooked before. The first one being Ivanova, and she is still one of the best toons in the game, in my opinion. Her active skill is amazing with focus and attack up. Her rush, defense down, and now this trauma is actually pretty useful. She also has a great leadership skill, and being a green toon, she can hold a stun on attack weapon. This makes her to be an awesome toon, and the 2000 trauma is just icing on the cake. Next, we'll take a look at Willie. When he rushes, he can apply 4,000 trauma, which could end up stacking with Ivanova's, for example, to create 6,000 trauma damage to a line of toons. He also applies stun as well as heal reduction to the enemy. So by Willie having the opportunity to apply more status effects, it also means the enemy could resist or recover from those status effects. In Willie's case, he can actively force the enemy to recover from the status effects. Angel is another great free-to-play toon that actually has trauma on her rush. Now, I've always kind of regretted upgrading her rush. I think I upgraded it only once or twice because trauma damage just wasn't that important before. Now I might be reconsidering that because it could be an effective defensive mechanism to have. Because if you can apply trauma to the enemy and then you apply different status effects, well, if the enemy ends up resisting them, there's some flat trauma damage for you that could help you secure the win. Another free-to-play toon that we've kind of gotten a couple of her. There's one in the season store and one in the battle pass. Fang. I've mentioned her before, and although her trauma damage is only 800, because trauma stacks and because her rush provides bleed as well as hemo bleed, for example, and her active skill provides exhaust, there's 3 different status effects that, if recovered, would create 800 times 3, which is 2,400 flat damage, which isn't half bad, especially when you consider you're probably running her on a bleed team, so the enemy might be bleeding out at the same time. Another toon that we can look at is Kyle. He is right now part of the Rotathon event, so he is a toon that you could pick up. It is a turn 3 active skill, but it is also 1200 trauma to a line. It could be a decent way at kind of picking off kind of the remaining toons, and it's kind of nice to see a variety of free-to-play toons that fall underneath this category. Again, I'm waiting for a trauma leader to come out that'll kind of just change the way we play the game again. Now, moving on, there are some toons that have great active skills that encompass the whole enemy team. So if you can apply a skill like how Wangfa applies heal reduction, for example, to everyone, that means if the enemy has a toon that can recover from heal reduction, well, if you have trauma applied, there's some flat damage. If they end up resisting the heal reduction, because I know I've placed heal reduction on a couple of my tanky toons, well, there's some more trauma damage. So trauma is actually a super powerful ability, but it's always been held back because of its limitations of being actively recovering a penalty versus now it's resisting a penalty. Like, we take a look at a lot of defensive toons, even Aaron. He has the ability to impair up to 3 enemies. If those enemies have trauma on them and resist the impair, well, that could be like 4,000 flat trauma damage in the case of Willy, for example. There's just so much that you could actually do with this, and it will take some getting used to because it's not like your typical auto teams. It would be very specific, and you'd have to use very specific toons to make it function well. With her active skill being able to impair 5 enemies, if trauma is applied, well, there's so many toons that recover from impair. I've been using Alice and Maggie on my attack team to recover from impair, but if there's trauma applied and I recover from it, I'm probably killing half my team just by recovering that impair. It'll be crazy actually to see the types of teams that people come up with. And I guess now I'll talk about kind of how to counter some of this. So a lot of people, myself included, run double resists on a defensive toon. Now, the other option you could go with is just tanking out your team. There's not much you can do about having that one resist mod because there's definitely going to be something you want to resist. And I'm not saying you need to have a trauma resist mod on your toon. Like, I still think a lot of people are going to run infection and heal reduction in combination. So I'm going to leave a heal reduction resist mod on my Georgia, but I'm going to add a defense when stunned mod. So I'm not resisting the stun, I'm allowing the stun to happen, and I'm getting a defensive bonus while it's happening. Those types of mods I think are going to become more prevalent on defensive teams. So like, I just ended up switching my defense when confused off of Ivanova, and I can use bleed or a burn mod, for example, if I want to apply a penalty to the enemy, if I think there's a toon that'll recover it. So Mercer is an example, Arav is an example. Even when we get to Traitor, he's a big example, especially if he has a cleanse weapon. These defensive cleanse weapons could now be the downfall of a lot of different teams. Because if I'm able to apply, say, a 35 burn mod to Traitor, he doesn't resist it, so there's no trauma taken. But then all of a sudden, he ends up having that 35% chance to cleanse himself of that small burn mod, which would otherwise do 35 burn damage over 2 turns or something. It's now doing a flat amount of damage, anywhere from 800 trauma to 4,000 trauma damage, which is a huge amount. And in this next little bit of filming, we're just going to showcase like how trauma can stack, and then also talk about what type of repercussions there are on the defensive team. So for example, that resilience, if I had trauma applied, that would trigger trauma. Now here on the second turn, I can apply trauma, or at least try to. Here we can see that Traitor was able to resist it from Ivanova, but took 3,000 trauma from Angel. He also resisted the trauma from Willy, but because of that resistance, he would then trigger the trauma off of Angel. So that would be a flat amount of 3,000 trauma. And it's 3,000 trauma damage per resistance or per recovery. So this is actually a super powerful method of taking down some very tanky teams, because unmitigated damage means you ignore a toon's defensive stat. Personally, I think I might come up with a trauma team just for fun, just to see how I could run it, what I would run it against, and I think I could end up coming up with something clever, but it would definitely take some time. It would be weapon intensive. Your mods, you could just run like small bleed mods or burn mods just to apply that little bit of extra damage that could end up being a lot of damage. So guys, let me know in the comment section below what you think of the update, and if you think you might run a trauma team in the future. And as always, thank you everyone for watching and listening to my video. I hope you guys learned something and that it was helpful.